Thanks so much, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak at this important meeting. And just to note, I was previous president of FENS, and FENS is co-hosting the IUNS meeting in Paris next year. So I'm going to talk about what is inflammation, when it's a concern, say something about what we call the resolution of inflammation, then move on to Mediterranean diet, and then wrap up. So the inflammatory response is a physiological response which we can measure by measuring chemicals in the bloodstream, things like C-reactive proteins, certain cytokines. We can measure activated cells in the bloodstream. So we know when an inflammatory response is happening. That response is initiated by exposure to particular triggers. Normally we think of microbes, so things like bacteria, as the trigger for the inflammatory response. But in fact, it can also be triggered by tissue damage, metabolic stress, and indeed oxidative stress. The link between the trigger and the response is the cellular processes that are initiated by the trigger. So triggers bind to receptors on the surface of inflammatory cells. They initiate cell signaling processes which activate the cells, enhancing gene expression or pro-inflammatory gene expression, and then the production of the chemicals that I mentioned. The inflammatory response is designed to be protective, but it can also be harmful to us. And the 5 cardinal signs of inflammation are heat, redness, swelling, pain, and loss of function. And those signs are caused by the chemicals that are produced as part of the response. So lots of anti-inflammatory medications act to either decrease the production of those chemicals or to block their action. We now know that inflammation has 2 phases, the initiation phase and the resolution phase. And that's really important in terms of understanding what's going on here. So normally, physiologically, inflammation should be self-limiting. So it should be initiated upon exposure to the trigger, it can be propagated, and when the job is done, it should resolve and the system should return to homeostasis, and any damage should be repaired. The question is, what if there is no resolution? So one thing that can happen is we can get prolonged, high-grade chronic inflammation. And this can lead to metabolic changes, tissue damage, pathology, loss of function, and even death in some circumstances. For example, the cytokine storm in COVID-19 is unresolved high-grade inflammation. We now also recognize another phenomenon, which is chronic low-grade inflammation. So this is ongoing inflammation which is long-lasting and may not necessarily be harmful for a short period of time, but becomes harmful later on. So we have these 2 situations, high-grade inflammation. So this is a characteristic of the pathology of diseases like arthritis, inflammatory bowel disease, asthma, and so on, where there's a clear link between the unresolved inflammation and the disease. But we now also know that inflammation, low-grade inflammation, is involved in the common diseases of lifestyle and poor diet, cardiovascular diseases, metabolic diseases, cognitive decline, many cancers, loss of lean mass, excess deposition of fat mass, and also immune decline. These diseases are also a characteristic of aging, and in fact there's a phenomenon called inflammaging, where aging is associated with an increase in low-grade inflammation. So the question for today, of course, is diet a trigger for inflammation, or can diet be used to modify the inflammatory process? Maybe there are some dietary components that increase inflammation, and there are other dietary components that decrease inflammation. So first of all, how could dietary components increase inflammation? So it's possible that there are actually triggers. So I think a classic example, which I'm not going to talk any more about today, is in food allergy, you actually have food components that are triggers to the inflammatory response. And of course, you deal with that by avoiding those foods. But there's also some indications that saturated fatty acids can act as inflammatory triggers. And then there's lots of food components which can up or down modulate the inflammatory process. So they could be positive modulators of pro-inflammatory signaling cascades. They could be pro-oxidants, so things like advanced glycated end products promote inflammation. They could be precursors of pro-inflammatory chemicals, so arachidonic acid is a good example. Meat is a big source of arachidonic acid. And they could also be things that cause gut dysbiosis, like free sugars. So all of those things, there is some evidence that they enhance inflammation. Then on the other side, there are some chemicals that act to help us control inflammation. So a good example would be negative modulators of pro-inflammatory signaling pathways. So many polyphenols that we already heard something about today, omega-3 fatty acids, which Jacques mentioned, are negative modulators of inflammatory signaling. Many antioxidants, vitamins, minerals, polyphenols, and those dietary components that promote a healthy gut microbiome, things like fibers, some shorter chain oligosaccharides, and so on. I just want to come back now to this idea that resolution of inflammation is really important. So we know a lot about the things that initiate and keep inflammation going, but what about those things that resolve inflammation? Is there anything in the diet that could be important in inflammation resolution? So first of all, resolution was only recognized about 20 years ago, and using animal models, researchers mainly in the United States look for chemicals that were produced in the resolution phase of inflammation. And amongst the many different chemicals that were identified, these researchers identified new, previously unknown families of lipid mediators that are produced during the resolution of inflammation. These are not the only pro-resolving chemicals, but they seem to be very important pro-resolving chemicals. And they named them or classified them into 3 different families. Resolvins, because they resolve inflammations. Protectins, because they protect against inflammation, particularly neuroinflammation. And maressins, which are macrophage-derived pro-resolving chemicals. And together, resolvins, protectins, and maressins are termed specialized pro-resolution mediators, or SPMs. And the reason this is very exciting, especially to me, because of my passion for long-chain omega-3 fatty acids, is these specialized pro-resolving mediators are produced from eicosapentaenoic acid and docosahexaenoic acid, EPA and DHA, the 2 long-chain omega-3 fatty acids that Jacques mentioned are found in fish, particularly oily fish. So this is the pathway for conversion of EPA to E-series resolvins and the conversion of DHA to D-series resolvins, maressins, and protectins. These are very interesting and complicated pathways which are not fully established just yet. But the idea is you have an inflammatory trigger that initiates acute inflammation, and physiologically that acute inflammation will resolve, and part of the resolution process involves the production of these omega-3 fatty acid derived specialized pro-resolving mediators. And of course, the resolution, you eventually get return to homeostasis, tissue repair and healing. If the acute inflammation doesn't resolve, it can become chronic, and I already mentioned that chronic inflammation causes tissue damage, pathology, and so on. And using animal models of diseases like arthritis, colitis, asthma, sepsis, it's been shown that the application of these specialized pro-resolving mediators can resolve, if you like, chronic inflammation, causing the resolution. So this is an interesting sort of relatively new area in the field. So what I've added to my pendulum of inflammation here is things that are precursors of anti-inflammatory and pro-resolution chemicals, and particularly the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids. So we've got foods on the left, or nutrients on the left, that promote inflammatory processes, and nutrients on the right, which help to control inflammatory processes. course, I think you've seen lots of the Mediterranean diet pyramid today, and lots of the things that are, let's call them anti-inflammatory, are found in foods that are part of the Mediterranean diet pyramid. So there's been quite some interest in how the Mediterranean diet relates to biomarkers of inflammation. So these are studies from the results from the nurses' health study and the physician study, two big epidemiological cohorts in the United States. And these studies both show that greater adherence to a healthy diet, particularly in the top part here, to the Mediterranean diet, so people with a higher Mediterranean diet score. Remember, these are people living in North America. With a higher Mediterranean diet score, have lower concentrations of prototypical markers of inflammation, including C-reactive protein and some of the cytokines. And then in the bottom, a higher prudent diet score, so this essentially is a healthier diet, again, lower concentrations of prototypical markers of inflammation. So those studies suggest that a more healthy diet is associated with less low-grade inflammation. And the opposite, therefore, must be true. An unhealthy diet must be associated with greater low-grade inflammation. And indeed, the study here shows that greater adherence to a Western diet pattern is associated with higher concentrations of these prototypical markers of inflammation. So the Mediterranean diet is associated with less inflammation. Association studies show that when other things are adjusted for, higher whole grain consumption, higher fruit and veg consumption, higher fish consumption, higher nut consumption, and higher olive oil consumption are all associated with lower inflammation. So the food components of the Mediterranean diet individually are associated with less inflammation. Of course, they're association studies, so they don't actually demonstrate cause and effect. So you have to alter the diet to show a cause and effect relationship. And you would do that preferably in a randomized controlled trial. And of course, we have a very good randomized controlled trial of the Mediterranean diet, which several speakers have already mentioned, which is the PREDIMED diet. So this is a subgroup of the PREDIMED intervention. This is at 3 months of intervention with 275 individuals in one of each of the three groups, which you'll remember were the Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil, the Mediterranean diet with nuts, and the control diet, which was termed a low-fat diet. 90% of these individuals were overweight or obese, and half of them were diabetic. And what we have is the change from baseline with the 3 months of intervention for C-reactive protein, ICAM1, interleukin-6, and VCAM1. So these are 4 markers of inflammation. And the open bar is the Mediterranean diet with extra virgin olive oil. So you see that intervention decreased all 4 markers of inflammation. The next is the Mediterranean diet with nuts, which decreased 3 out of 4 of the markers of inflammation. And then the low-fat diet, which either didn't change the markers of inflammation or increase them. But the key thing is an intervention with Mediterranean diets decreased biomarkers of inflammation, and that happened within a 3-month period. Of course, PREDIMED isn't the only intervention study of the Mediterranean diet. So there are systematic reviews of randomized controlled trials of the Mediterranean diet and biomarkers of inflammation. And these are the results of one of these systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So what's found is C-reactive protein, IL-6, and ICAM1 are all significantly decreased with the Mediterranean diet compared to control. Now, I mentioned in passing that one of the means of controlling inflammation is the gut microbiota. And it's quite clear that there are particular organisms in the microbiota that favor inflammation, and there are particular organisms that help to control inflammation. And again, this is a review article. It's got a lot of really excellent information and very nice tables and figures. But the summary here is that the Mediterranean diet, perhaps because of its high fiber content, its antioxidants, its unsaturated fatty acids, and its low red meat, improves a number of bacteria that are associated with reduced low-grade inflammation. So maybe part of the Mediterranean diet effect on inflammation is mediated by gut microbiota. So here I try to bring all of this together. So we've got effects on microbiota, which can influence inflammation. Of course, you can have effects on inflammation without involving the gut microbiota. And we've got healthy dietary patterns, which help control inflammation and promote healthy gut microbiota. We've got the food components of those healthy dietary patterns. We've got the nutrient components of those foods, and I've added probiotics on here just for completion's sake. And then on the other side, we've got dietary patterns that promote inflammation and promote an adverse gut microbiota, some of the food components of those sorts of diets, and some of the nutrients and non-nutrients that are part of those foods. So people often ask me, what is an anti-inflammatory diet? And I would say, well, it's something a bit like the Mediterranean diet. And if you look up, if you Google anti-inflammatory diet and click on images, this is the sort of pictures you get. So these are just pictures of the Mediterranean diet, okay? So there's nothing special about an anti-inflammatory diet, I don't think. So just to finish up, inflammation is a key part of how we defend ourselves, but it should self-resolve. If that doesn't happen and we get a high-grade inflammation, that can result in pathology. But we now also know that low-grade inflammation, chronic low-grade inflammation, I call this silent inflammation, is also an important contributor to non-communicable diseases. It's also a feature of aging. Healthy diets, and of course we're focusing on the Mediterranean diet today, and their constituent foods and nutrients are linked to lower levels of inflammatory markers. This comes from both cohort studies and randomized controlled trials. Gut microbiota is also a link between diet and inflammation, but it's not the only one, okay? Diet does not affect inflammation only via the gut microbiota, okay? That is one mechanism, but it's not the only one. It may or may not be the most important one. And I think an anti-inflammatory diet is just the same as commonly recommended healthy diets, and I think Mediterranean diet is such a diet. And we have to promote these healthy diets to decrease the likelihood of excessive low-grade inflammation. And I know we're here promoting the IUNS conference, but I just want to bring to your attention another conference, a virtual conference, that'll be happening at the end of October. So keep an eye out for this conference on diet and lifestyle factors in health and disease. Thanks very much for your attention.